ISHR student, we are back with the next in the video lecture series. I hope you are ready to learn. Today we're going to be talking about long-run aggregate supply. This is really important for not only understanding economic theory, but also understanding this really timeless debate that economists have been arguing over for years. And in a way, it also kind of illustrates almost how politics and economics are sort of intertwined, because different groups, different political groups tend to have different opinions about economics and how much of a role the government should take in economics. So it's really important to understand this concept. So let's go ahead and go over our learning goals for the day. First big one, we need to understand what long-run aggregate supply is and what it represents. You get a chance to go over that in just a second and write it down. Next, we need to create a long-run aggregate supply curve, so make one yourself, and then we also need to understand how the position of AD and SRAS, or short-run aggregate supply, can show an economy that's either having an inflationary or recessionary gap. Next, I want to show how economic growth is demonstrated in the long run, how we really show real economic growth in the long run, and we'll teach you about that as well. And finally, and this is probably the most important point of what we're going to go over today, is the difference, or we want to be able to differentiate Keynes and the Keynesian curve. He has a different supply curve, and neoclassical theory. Again, this is that age-old debate that we just have to discuss. So this might be divided into two videos, but let's go ahead and get right to it on what is long-run aggregate supply. Basically what it is, it's kind of like the productive capacity in the economy. If we're using all of our factors of production, if we're using everything, our land, our labor, our capital, our entrepreneurship, if we're using all of those things, then that shows what we are capable of producing. So it sort of represents our, if we're using all of our resources, our productive capacity, what we can produce. And in a way, it's very similar to a PPC curve, right? A PPC curve represents also what we can produce. You know, we've got one here with capital and consumer goods, and you can see that we can produce any amount of goods on this curve, right? Well, if we are not using all of our resources, we would be at point D, meaning, you know, we're not employing all of our factors of production. So note that if we are using all of our factors of production, and to their greatest extent, we would be using, that would be our productive capacity. If we're not using all of our resources, this would be sort of inefficient, and we would be underutilizing our factors of production. Here, point E, as you can see, this is kind of where, you know, it's unattainable, it's impossible. Based on our current level of our ability to produce goods and services, we can't produce E. So, you know, that PPC curve, something we've already learned, kind of is very similar to long-run aggregate supply. So please understand that. Okay, next, if you wanted to draw a long-run aggregate supply diagram, you just basically make the SRAS curve and the AD curve, the short-run aggregate supply and AD curve, and generally, the starting spot for most people is that long-run aggregate supply sort of is overlapping of the equilibrium point of AS and AD. So basically, this is what your long-run diagram looks like. Now, in this case, this diagram, we see that, you know, since they're overlapping, we are at the full employment level of production. Remember, we said that long-run aggregate supply is kind of like our productive capacity. It is like it has to do with all of our factors of production and whether or not we're using them. If we are at the point right here where we're producing, where AD meets SRAS, and that overlaps with long-run aggregate supply, we are producing at our productive capacity. And most economists believe that this is sort of where equilibrium will be in the long run. That there could be short-term and long-term fluctuations, or short-term fluctuations, but in the long term we'll always go to that. Anyway, so The next two concepts are called a recessionary and inflationary gap. And we'll go ahead and show you how that's different in relation to this long run level of output. But we'll save that for the next